Welcome back to How a Realist Hero Built the Kingdom, Anime Review episode number 19. This episode covers most of chapter 1 of book 4. Yep, we're finally book 4 now. Now, they actually do make an immediate cut before the start of the episode, because the first portion of the chapter that this episode is a complete info dump on the character. We're going to focus in this episode, Ludwig Arcs. Yeah, there's a complete info dump about him at the start of the chapter, and they completely removed that from the anime. My guess, time. Yes, so this thing starts off with a scene in the government affairs office. You have Sotoma, you have the Prime Minister there, and that's it. Because in the book, this scene didn't have the Prime Minister here at all. He was not in the scene. They had Aisha in the scene, along with, of course, Lucia. For some reason, they removed them from this scene, because even though Lucia does pop up a little later, it seems completely random. But like, she shows up right after this brief conversation, where you have basically Sotoma and Haruku discussing post-war stuff, and then Ludwig breaks into the office, just bursts right in, just apologizes. It says a close acquaintance. Of course, his first line is directly from the book, where he says a close acquaintance of mine basically is something really scandalous. That is something he said in the book, so it's good they kept it in. And mentioned the whole thing about mad scientist, the fact that she's a mage for the Forbidden Army. That's stuff they kept in. And also in the book itself, they mentioned that, that Ludwig did mention that he knew somebody who actually was kind of basically a mad scientist that Sotoma was interested in meeting her. They completely cut this out of the anime. But tiny big conversation moving on here. And of course, Lucia is grabbed by Sotoma to go to this dungeon, which they mention is a converted dungeon. They don't really mention the anime, because they go to this random area in the anime where they come across a garage door. Yes, which apparently Ludwig does know what a garage is, and apparently Lucia in the anime, no, there's no mention of Ludwig knowing what the thing is, because they cut that line of the anime, and Lucia basically questioning what is a garage. Yes. And then we see an old-fashioned, get this, an old-fashioned communication device. With this, I've actually seen this. Pictures of this thing. Basically, yelling this particular horn, and you get to hear the other end. Then, of course, he opens the door up, and it's a big staircase. It's a metal staircase that's lit up. Which is suspected it's actually magic. No, they actually edited in the anime you have Sotoma basically knocking on the metal, which he didn't do that in the book. And so, of course, they get down to the bottom, and then they open up the door down there, and we get introduced to Gina Maxwell, an eccentric scientist, who is... I'm surprised Sotoma doesn't point out, hey, this attire looks very similar to attire from my world. And also, he introduced himself... Actually, no, before that, that actually didn't happen at that door, it happened at a different door. He goes into the particular laboratory, which looks like side of a computer. No, seriously, it looks like a computer. And there's a log cabin there, which I see as like, what the heck is a log cabin doing in a dungeon? They mention this area as they mention dungeon, but they don't really go in detail of it. In the book, they mention this was an abandoned dungeon that was converted by the Maxwell family into a research facility. In the anime, they don't really... They bring up a little bit in the anime. It's like they cut a lot of the information out there. And then, of course, they introduce each other. And, by the way, Gina, for some reason, is one of those scientists in anime where it's like, or it's even American cartoons too, where the hands had to be underneath the long... It's like, basically, she's wearing a lab coat where the sleeves are way too long for her. And I'm like, okay, why the heck is she doing this for? So, she does bring up the fact that she was basically banished from the actual facility, from another facility, where she developed a device to basically create a sea of trees, which got her in trouble with the Forbidden Army, banished this dungeon. And then they have a conversation about the gemstones. Now, that portion, from what I can tell from reading the chapter, that a lot of this is from the book itself. There's actually a big chunk here of this conversation was cut, mostly about my world and this world, stuff like that. And Lucia responded to that. Yeah, that was all cut from the anime, probably due to time, because this whole conversation takes up 5 pages of the book. And then right after this conversation, they go right outside, and then they introduced little Sultama Mark 5. Sultama does mark in the book about what happened to Marks 1 through 4 when they blown up. In the anime, he doesn't question it. No, he doesn't. And they activate the device, which basically, by the way, this device is a propulsion system that's basically the shape of a giant O, or at least a 0. And of course, they kind of switch around the next little bit here of conversation, where the way presented the anime is slightly, now this next bit that happens after the propulsion thing, that does happen in the book, but it's slightly presented a little bit out of order. Where in the anime, the presented is like this: like after the device is completed, you have someone briefly talking to Lucia about this, and then after the conversation, like, oh, Ludwig clearly 199% does like Gina, and from Lucia's perspective, Gina likes Ludwig 60%. That bit of line dialogue is in the book itself, but happened just after Ludwig had based. Now, Sultman asking before this little bit of conversation if Ludwig does actually love Gina. In the anime, he says, "Do you like Gina?" And he is blushing at this. Yep. They also cut the bit out here where they were raised as brother and sister, and they mentioned that basically that Gina is the last of the Maxwells. Her parents are deceased, along with Ludwig's parents. They completely cut that out of the anime. I mean, it's implied that they could be still alive, but in the book, they're clearly dead. Which I think that was a bit of info they should not have cut from the anime. They did mention about the whole her being the last of the Maxwells. They kept that portion in, but they cut the portion out where parents are dead. Yes. Maybe a sore subject is probably the reason I cut it. So then, of course, like you have, of course, before that, you have someone mentioned Lucia. We need to have her marry someone important, someone we trust, and want to have her marry Ludwig. And then he asks her, and then he says to Ludwig, "Hey Gina, would you like to become Ludwig's wife?" And of course, Ludwig proposes to her immediately on the spot. And they actually do change the dialogue a bit, because in the book he says, "I don't know if I'm noble wife material." In the anime, she says, "I don't know if I'm noble woman material." And immediately after she accepts, he just bops her in the head, because they feel what the heck the reason why they called her there, not because of the device. The scandalous stuff. What was she did? She stole Dragon Bones. And that's where the episode ends. Quite an interesting episode. Yes, I do admit basically cutting out some info here probably was good for pacing. Yes, like the Ludwig dump, I think that was basically fine cutting that. If you want to add that to, let's say, an opening narration, that'd be perfect for that. But for a story, no, you probably don't need it though. And some other bits basically are fine. I think the one bit in this episode they probably should not have cut was the mentioning about the status of the parents of Ludwig and Gina. And in the anime, the whole thing of Dragon Ball, that's where the anime ends. The episode ends, and it looks like they'll have to read the synopsis for next week. Oh boy, I am so happy with this, because next week we're going to see something I love reading our original of this book last year, which was Sultama meeting Roronoa for the first time. Which I hope they keep, there's a particular line I hope they keep in, and how they're introduced, I hope they keep in, because that's important. Because this is clearly a big event that happens in the book, which I'm so looking forward to this. The scene is in the anime, and it's going to be next episode, which I'm so looking forward to. Yep. So yeah, that's going to be pretty much it for this particular review. This episode is just a pretty good episode. Yes. So next review is going to be Demon Slayer, and it's the final episode of season 2. You'll find out my thoughts on that soon. Okay, next video. Bye.